The UK government is turbo boosting. Their words, the preparations for a no-deal Brexit on October 31st.
Yeah, the Chancellor Sajid Javid today made an additional £2.1 billion available for contingency no-deal planning, which he says will be spent on ensuring that the UK is ready to leave the EU in 3 months' time, come what may. £344 million of that will go to ramping up border and customs operations. £434 million will go to ensuring a continuous supply of vital medicines can reach those who need them, and £138 million will be spent on a public information campaign to support British citizens both at home and abroad.
Well, joining us now is Tom Harwood. He's reported for the Guido Fawkes website, and Mayor Goodfellow, the journalist and academic. Welcome to you both. Tom, let me start with you. How feasible is it to spend such a large amount of money in such a comparatively short space of time?
Well, if we contextualise the amount of money that's being spent, £2 billion, that's actually only 10% of our annual debit to the European Union, which is £20 billion a year. So it's a comparatively small amount of money to get out of the European Union, rather than the £20 billion a year we spend every single year for being a member of it. It seems like a very prudent and sensible thing to do to prepare for that eventuality of no deal, which the government says it doesn't want to deliver. It would like a deal, but at the end of the day, the only way that you can ensure that you get a deal that can pass through Parliament is by saying that you're ready to walk away if something that's satisfactory isn't offered.
Tom's right, Mayor. It is prudent for a government to plan for every eventuality, and let's face it, at the end of the day, it might not just be our decision to walk away. The EU might say, look, there's no prospect of a deal in the Parliament. We're not going to extend.
Well, I think you have to think about why that is, and that's really the failure of the Conservative Party to get any consensus on a deal. And I think this idea that no deal needs to be a political possibility, actually, there's a real problem with the Prime Minister saying that when he's saying, you know, deal with the Irish backstop, we can find a way around it. That's really not going to happen. And part of the reason why I think this huge amount of money that's being spent is incredibly reckless, as well as the no deal preparations, is that firstly, it is galling to see a government whip out this money after they have taken so much money away from our public services for the past 9 years. Boris Johnson and his cabinet are people who have helped oversee huge cuts to our schools, to our hospitals. We are living in a country where homelessness has more than doubled since 2010. If you look at legal aid, £1 billion was taken out of the legal aid budget. And the other thing, as well as that, which I think people will be incredibly worried about and looking at the government and thinking, what are they doing, is this creates so much uncertainty. So it's not just saying, oh, you know, no deal needs to be a possibility, otherwise the EU is never going to come through the negotiations. No, what's actually happening is we have no deal now as this big possibility, and it's creating even more uncertainty than we've had for the past 3 years, which is bad for small businesses, it's bad for the economy, and it means that people, when they're going on holiday this summer, their money is not going as far.
Right, the Prime Minister himself says that there's only a 1 in a million chance that there's going to be a no-deal Brexit. Isn't £2 billion an awful lot to be spending on something that's only a 1 in a million chance?
Well, it's only a 1 in a million chance if we prepare for it. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but it's only that we will get a deal that's different from Theresa May's deal, that doesn't have the anti-democratic backstop in it, that's something that can pass through Parliament if we prepare for no deal. It's basic negotiation strategy. But I want to take Maya up on some of the points that she raised, because the Conservative Party, when it came to government in 2010, was left with a note from the Labour Party saying there's no money left. For every £4 that the government was spending, it was borrowing £1. Now it's only borrowing 1 out of every £34 it spends. That's a massive shoring up of our financial capability, and that management over the last 9 years means that now the government is able to put more money into policing, into healthcare, into those issues that Maya rightly raised.
I mean, unfortunately, that's just not how the economy works. And what we've seen consistently for the past 9 years is the Conservatives take away from some of the poorest in society. And all good economics shows that if you invest in the economy, actually you increase people's spending power. If you invest in our infrastructure, you create jobs, and it means
economy is one of the fastest growing in Europe right now.
But the point is as well about no deal, actually, is the way this is being talked about by people who are pro no deal is as if you have no deal and then everything is going to be fine. This is the very, very start of negotiations. We're not even even at the stage of negotiations properly with the EU. So going ahead with no deal and potentially doing severe economic damage to the country, it doesn't put the UK in a good position going forward
So
to
the
negotiate a
reason
deal
why this
with
£2
the EU,
billion
which is our
is
biggest
being
trading
spent
partner.
now is that it won't do severe economic damage. Planning means that there won't be those horrible consequences that could happen. You're right. If a government weren't to plan, weren't to spend, and we went into no deal, there could be severe problems.
But Tom, this is not just in the UK's hands, right? I mean, we can spend £2 billion trying to mitigate this, and even the Governor of the Bank of England was saying today that may mitigate to some degree, but not completely, as we were hearing earlier in the programme. But to some extent, this is going to be up to the French and French customs controls, and they could still cause us problems in a no-deal scenario, however much has been spent this side on the British side of the Channel.
There are variables in all situations, and actually I think that no deal is very unlikely, precisely because we're preparing for it, precisely because economic actors are usually rational, precisely because we could, for example, offer the European Union this GATT24 mechanism that means with their consent we can continue to trade for 2 years on the same terms that we're trading now while we prepare for our future relationship. But also, once we leave the European Union...
That's so long as the EU agrees to trade on those terms.
That's exactly. We can offer them that, and they might choose to accept it. If they were economically rational, they would. But if they don't, if they want to be a hostile foreign power to us, which I think would be pretty extraordinary in terms of their nearest and closest and most important trading partner that we are, if they want to do that, then there are lots of unilateral things that we can do to ensure that we get cheaper goods into our country. We can unilaterally, without anyone else's say-so, lower tariffs for the first time in 40 years. And that means cheaper imports, cheaper food on the table. Consumers will be much better off because of that.
Isn't the problem, Maya? I mean, the government, the last government was being criticised because it hadn't spent this money. It was behind the curve, behind the European Union, and the Chancellor, of course, who was a Remainer, didn't want to spend that money. So isn't this just catch-up?
No, I think that actually what has happened since we had that referendum is we've seen a Conservative government not really deal with these negotiations in a sensible way. We didn't see Theresa May approach this in the way that she should have, and we saw her drawing these red lines very early on, which was incredibly unhelpful. But I don't just want to rehash the past here. I think actually what we haven't talked so much about, which is incredibly important, is the Irish border. And so much of this conversation does revolve around that, and it necessarily should, but at the same time it is being obscured. So this idea that no deal should be a political possibility, what does that mean for Ireland? And at the same time, this idea from Boris Johnson that the EU needs to listen and needs to sort out the backstop and find some kind of alternative arrangements. I'm sorry, but this is just, they're living in another world. And the point here is not just to attack the government, it's to recognise how serious this could be for Ireland and Northern Ireland and that border, how serious that is. And I think that how serious that is for peace in Northern Ireland is not being engaged with at all.
Very right to raise
that.
Right,
we have to leave, Maya, Tom, I'm sorry, we have to leave it there. Maya, Goodfellow, Tom Harwood, thank you both very much for joining us. We will get back to this conversation, have you both back on another time. I'm sure we could go a full programme on this one, Christian.